Perfect. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mikelatou, and this is another episode of the member series of ITSS Verona for the channel for human security. Together, we're going to discuss human security and how it is related to cybersecurity. And with us, we have Dr. Tim Stevens from King's College London to discuss on this very interesting topic. Hello, Doctor. It was very nice having you here.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being with us. So let me begin with in what ways do you think that cybersecurity contributes to protecting basic human needs, safety, access to services, privacy?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a very broad answer in a sense. Which, if you consider that pretty much everything we do these days has a digital component, by which I mean that it's enabled or supported by digital networks and systems, all of which are vulnerable to a variety of threats, then cybersecurity can help with some aspects of protecting people and things, and data that depend upon the proper functioning of those digital systems. So cybersecurity is about securing from threats, um, and it's threats that arise because of our dependence on these digital systems. And dependence, the flip side of dependence, if you like, is vulnerability. And we're all vulnerable to particular types of cyber insecurity, and the very wide suite of actions and measures and so on that comprise cybersecurity helps us in our daily lives. It helps us with our access to essential services. It ensures our privacy, and to a certain extent, it helps ensure our safety as well in the ways that we interact and do our business and so on online.
Indeed, indeed. And it's very interesting how everyone now is inside the cyberspace, is on internet doing something. Yes, so everyone, as you say, is vulnerable. It doesn't matter where they come from, right?
Some people are perhaps more vulnerable than others because it's not just about threats, it's also about what we do online. We have a responsibility and a role to try and ensure our own security to a certain extent. But that's not the end of the story. I mean, the essential argument here is that if you think about cyberspace, the internet, the web, and digital networks and systems as being the infrastructure of modern daily life on which we depend, we are all exposed to a certain extent, yes.
And I suppose this can also include our basic services like healthcare services, financial state systems, and of course, platforms like social media and any other communication platform.
Absolutely. And I think that's the really important story here, because when we think about the internet, a lot of us just think about the apps and the social media that we use and perhaps the business systems that we use. But you go down to the deeper level, when you think about the critical infrastructures that we rely on, which are all but invisible, right? You don't think about them every day because you don't see them every day.
Yeah.
But underneath healthcare, logistics, transport, government communications, military, water, energy, and so on, they all rely on digital systems that are themselves vulnerable. And those critical infrastructures, even though they might be invisible, are absolutely essential to the way that we function as modern societies. And cybersecurity has an absolutely pivotal role in protecting those critical infrastructures from forms of cyber insecurity and cyber threats.
And how can someone who doesn't understand how the cyberspace works and how the internet works and how cybersecurity is so related to every aspect of our life, how can we make them understand how important it is? Or maybe even if you can provide some example of, I don't know, some big cyber attacks that happened and they had uh, very bad impacts on human security.
Well, one of the classic cases at the moment is really looking at, if you look at a single sector, for example, like healthcare
Mm-hmm.
and healthcare, modern healthcare, patient record systems, actual primary medical care, nursing, and everything else. And of course, the whole range of support services in healthcare, like blood testing and so on, they all rely on digital systems. All right, and the healthcare sector has been a very rich target, if you like, for cyber criminals who are seeking to exploit them in various ways. And you may have heard of something called ransomware,
Yeah.
which is a form of software that essentially locks up a target system until a ransom is paid. And healthcare has been the frequent target of ransomware actors. And the thinking there from the criminal perspective is because healthcare is so essential to everything that we do, but it's also so emotive um, that if they launch ransomware attacks against healthcare actors, then they'll pay up because you have to have access to patient data, you have to be able to run a hospital, and so on. So that's really exploiting not just the technical vulnerabilities of the healthcare sector, which, like every other sector, has many, but also the social vulnerabilities, exploiting our dependence, and also to a certain extent, exploiting the way that we think about healthcare as being an absolutely pivotal aspect of what we expect in a modern society.
And what would, well, let's say hospitals in this case would
Mm.
have to do in order to stop their building from burning, essentially, because cyber attacks like having your building on fire and not being able to see it.
Well, they face the same technical challenges as any other organization, which is ensuring that it seems a very simplistic thing to say, but ensuring high levels of security in the digital networks and systems on which hospitals run. But also, hospitals aren't just a single organization, they're reliant on lots of other sort of supply chains and logistics chains and other firms and public sector organizations as well. So understanding your environment, understanding what's at risk, understanding what you need to do to secure those better. But also, this is not cybersecurity is never just a kind of we do this once and then
Mm.
everything's going to be secure. This is an ongoing process. The threat is very, very adaptive. It's very, very fast moving. And so you actually need, dedicated teams within a hospital or within the healthcare sector that understand the environment and are able to generate intelligence that can then be used to make decisions about what needs to be secured, where we might put resources, and so on. So it's like any organization, a hospital needs to understand its dependencies, needs to understand its vulnerabilities, and it has to put in place a plan of action to secure those digital resources and assets as best as it can.
And what about if there are some advancements that in cybersecurity that you believe that maybe are helping human security, but there are some times that they are threatening human security? Are there any of these either now or coming in the future?
Yeah, well, a moment ago I mentioned ransomware, and this is a real threat to public and private sector organizations because what it's doing is locking up data or access to systems and then demanding a ransom to be paid. And of course, not everyone can either afford to pay or wants to pay. And in some jurisdictions, it's becoming illegal to pay. So ransomware is proving to be a very adaptive, creative, and concerning threat. And if you take the example of healthcare, and I think it's a really good one to illustrate this question or the answer to this question, or indeed any other kind of public sector service provision, um, is that people depend on them. So if you're waiting for an outpatient's appointment or surgery or medication, a prescription, and the digital systems are down, you can't just necessarily switch to paper and assume that you're going to be able to access those services. And whilst we haven't had any concrete evidence of people dying as a result of, say, ransomware or other cyber operations against the healthcare sector, it's not too hard to imagine that forms of harm can emerge from that. If you miss your prescription, if you miss your surgery, it causes a lot of pain and unnecessary suffering to the patients of that healthcare service. So that's quite a discrete example of how cyber threats can impact people's daily lives.
And so basically, we have, let's say, old school cyber threat, which is ransomware, that is being adapted to how our technology proceeds. Does AI play any role in this whole process of enhancing, let's say, such cyber attacks?
Yes, that one of the big questions around the use of AI in cybersecurity, and it's quite interesting from my perspective, is that we've been talking about AI in cybersecurity for quite a long time, and
Mm.
it's been used in the cybersecurity sector uh, for years. But since 2022, we're talking about AI in a much more kind of existential register, as it were. But we've been using machine learning in cybersecurity for many, many years. Now, the argument in the field is whether AI gives the defense an advantage or whether it gives the offense an advantage. And there are arguments in favor of both. And on the defensive side, you can use AI to scan the vulnerabilities and fix them very, very quickly. On the offensive side, you can do pretty much the same thing, but exploit the vulnerabilities that you find for offensive purposes. So one is protecting systems, and the other one is finding gaps in systems to exploit. But whether AI gives the defense or the offense an advantage at the moment, we don't really know. But there's lots of potential scenarios and use cases. I think for those people who, with some justification, think that AI is going to give offensive actors the edge, this is a very concerning development because we already have forms of malware that can adapt themselves and are relatively autonomous. And AI certainly threatens to supercharge some of those capabilities. So we're beginning to see how this is going to play out, but we don't really know the end game here. And of course, at the same time as we're doing this, defensive cybersecurity professionals are trying to shore up systems and make sure that those worst cases don't come to pass. So it's a really complex field. We don't know the outcome yet.
And since you discussed the worst case scenarios, how can our communities now prepare against the fallout of cyber attacks? Especially if we have AI in the middle, which not a lot of communities and corporations have adapted to that.
Yeah, I think the key to thinking through this is to consider that when we talk about cybersecurity, we're not just talking about securing systems from threats. There's no such thing as 100% perfect cybersecurity. Um, but what we're doing is we're coupling like a more classical form of security with forms of risk management. And in effect, what that's saying is that you can't ever totally eradicate the threat. You certainly can't control threat actors. But what you can do is turn your gaze a little bit inwards to the thing that you're trying to secure and work out how you can manage the risk to that thing. So is it a hospital or it's a data set or it's another form of critical infrastructure or something that you really care about and value. So what you're trying to do is manage the risk. And part of that very broad suite of risk management tools is something we call resilience. And resilience from a community perspective, I mean, resilience is just basically about anticipating something that something bad is going to happen, and it is going to in this environment, absorbing the impact of that event, uh, recovering from it, of course, which in terms of business continuity or service provision, and then of course adapting and feeding that back into your defensive or risk management posture. So it's essentially about planning ahead, and you'd be amazed at the number of organizations that don't. They think it's not going to happen to us, so we don't need to have a plan in place. We don't need to have a resilience plan or a recovery plan. But really, if you talk to cybersecurity professionals, they say, look, something bad is going to happen at some point. Expect the worst and plan accordingly. And being resilient is just as important as being secure. And hopefully, they will work together so that most of the time you can secure against the threat. But if something gets through, then you can be resilient to it. You can absorb it, you can recover, and you can adapt and improve your processes for the next time that something happens.
And the same thing applies to entire societies. How can we make entire societies resilient?
If I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be doing this job. It's a really big question, and I know that there are countries that have put an awful lot of thought into this. The Nordic countries, particularly, um, largely oriented to what they perceive as the threat from the east, um, have tried to make their societies as resilient as possible to a very wide range of threats and eventualities. it's difficult. People are people. They don't always act the way you want them to act. You can't
Mm.
always plan for every eventuality. But it's in countries like mine, like the UK, resilience is increasingly being spoken of at that societal level. But of course, we're not just talking about cybersecurity here. We're talking about all manner of different threats, informational threats through mis and disinformation, propaganda, and so on. That's a very kind of lively area of discussion and of policy. But I don't have a direct answer to your question.
Yeah, it is a very tough question. Everyone wants it answered. What I would say with what my thought would be is learn maybe from each other. For example, from 2017 Estonia, learn from that, learn from every country and what is happening to them, what possibly
Mhm.
can happen to us.
Yeah,
But if we're doing this, if we are sharing knowledge, let's say, with other countries, then how can we be 100% sure that within this sharing of information and knowledge and everything, we're also having data privacy? Because how can we be sure that, well, we don't have any individual's data leaked within our process?
yeah, that's a really complex issue, and originally cybersecurity, where it came from technical information security, and ideas around confidentiality were absolutely central to information security. They still are in cybersecurity. So making sure that the data that we have is not available to people who shouldn't have it, but also having confidence that our personal data or our business data is essentially private. Now, the problem with cybersecurity is that exactly as you say, when you talk about sharing information, it's about generating intelligence that enables you to make decisions for a large part. And intelligence relies on information. And in cybersecurity, because you're dealing with the internet, basically, you need an awful lot of data to be able to detect trends, see patterns, identify threats and threat actors, and then to think about how you can respond in real time. And you can only do that through big data sets. Now, somewhat inevitably, when you're scanning huge data sets, that may include data about us and our activities. So you need to have very robust data protection regulations in place and for them to be audited and monitored and so on, so that you can, for example, ensure anonymity. So that if you're using my data, it's not doesn't relate to me. It just relates to the things that you're actually interested in, which is the way that threat actors and malware behaves out there on the internet. So you have to have general data protection in place, not just at the national regulatory level or the legal level, but also at the organizational level. Businesses have a duty of care to not to splurge data everywhere. They need to protect their employees in the same way that you would expect a health service provider to protect our personal patient data. Ensure anonymity, minimize potential ethical problems, use only data that you need when required, which means you don't necessarily hang on to data sets for years and years and years. Because what you don't want is something like cybersecurity being equated to surveillance in any conventional understanding of that concept. Cybersecurity inevitably has a surveillance aspect, but it should only be about network and systems and problematic behaviors and malicious software and so on. It shouldn't be about what you and I say to one another on social media, for example. And that's something different. What's interesting is that in some jurisdictions, you will see cybersecurity, which is a relatively neutral, technical sounding concept, being used as a mask for actual surveillance. So, stretching the meaning of the term cybersecurity to incorporate all sorts of things that we might consider to be politically sensitive, or issues around gender, or ethnicity, or disability, or but in particularly in authoritarian or non-democratic regimes, you do see cybersecurity being used to cover, to provide a smokescreen for other types of activity that we wouldn't include as cybersecurity in most democracies. So there's constantly, even in democracies, a balancing act between what we need and what we shouldn't look at. But in some countries, they're not quite as sensitive about that distinction.
Yeah, and then we're not talking only about human security, we're also talking about human rights. So, how can we be sure in countries, for example, where cybersecurity is sort of neglected, how can we ensure that these human rights are also respected for?
Yeah, and I think you could take any country, in fact, and suggest that when you think about fundamental human rights, we're thinking about the freedom to do particular things or express oneself. We're thinking about safety, equality, the right to education, to work, health, and so on. And cybersecurity has a role to play in all of those. And obviously, improved cybersecurity can enhance and enable the types of things that allow us to exercise our rights uh, freely and without hindrance or obstruction. Now, obviously, poor cybersecurity, there have been numerous cases where services have gone down, for example, in the education sector, where students can't access their essays or their coursework or libraries. We had a huge cyber attack against the British Library, which meant that people couldn't access that. Now, it might not be eroding people's human rights not to be able to access a particular library, but if the sector is being hit, or if the health sector has a major problem, or energy grids, they are going to, if not impinge upon rights, they're certainly going to create problems for people who expect to be able to exercise their rights in terms of access to water, or to healthcare, or to power, and things like that. So cybersecurity, in a way, I mean, I don't think we've got to the point where neglect of cybersecurity is a human rights issue, although I think some people would make that argument. But you certainly can make the case that the abuse of cybersecurity is very definitely a threat to human rights. So there's quite a
Also,
lot of, go on.
sorry, could it also be, except for neglect, the underdefended cyber systems and
Yeah,
of a country?
it could be. Yeah, I mean, we can't just think at the country level though when we think about cybersecurity, because it's most cybersecurity is not done at the national level.
Mm.
Most cybersecurity is done at the organizational level by companies, by public sector organizations, by internet service providers, by telecoms companies, and so on. So, at the organizational level, that's where an awful lot of the responsibility lies. And even when you think about companies, there are lots of different types of companies. There's your very well capitalized, profitable companies with huge turnover and the resources that they can invest in cybersecurity should they choose to, as part of their overall risk management posture. But at the bottom of that heap, and in fact in the middle of that heap, are a whole lot of small and medium-sized enterprises who don't have big budgets for security, and where security is either ignored, or they keep their fingers crossed and hope nothing's going to happen, purely because they can't invest the money that they need to in security. So whilst it depends, cybersecurity might be neglected, but what are the reasons for that? It could be willful in the sense that we just don't think this is important, but it could just be resource constraints. We don't have the money to invest in cybersecurity, because if we do it in cybersecurity, we can't invest in our products or our services or our client-facing activities. So it's a very kind of complex matrix of different types of actors, different constraints and opportunities, and also the way that they perceive the value of cybersecurity, because there are lots of people out there and people working, CEOs and the like, who don't see the value in cybersecurity. They just see it as a kind of sunk cost. So you put money into cybersecurity and nothing happens. What's the economic value of that? Which most people will tell you is quite a short-sighted way of looking at it, because without good cybersecurity, you open yourselves up to all sorts of other risks. And there's obviously financial risk, business risk, and reputational risk that might come from poor cybersecurity. But at the national level, you asked me about countries. There are countries with much better developed coordinating structures and national policy than others. So inevitably, there are countries that are better defended, if you like, than some others. But no country has got it perfect, because they don't actually control all the levers.
Wow, this is all very, very interesting, and I believe we could sit down and talk about this issue for hours and hours. But I want to ask you one last question before we hang up. Uh, if we talk about the cybersecurity in a national level, shouldn't we also focus on the individual level in order to proceed to the national one? So we as citizens secure our laptops and phones.
It helps, yes. And if you talk to enough cybersecurity professionals, they will say that everybody has a stake in raising the bar of cybersecurity, and we can all do our part because any single device can be used as a vector of attack or compromise, particularly poorly secured consumer devices, whether that's laptops, cell phones, or Internet of Things devices, and so on. So we can all do our part. It's not the only part of the solution, because but you will find countries talking a lot more these days about whole of society responses, and that speaks a little bit to what you're talking about with national resilience too, and building awareness and helping people see that there is value for them in attempting to get basic cybersecurity right. But it's a really difficult thing to do, and I seem to have been looking at this topic for a very long time now. And some people would argue that things have just simply haven't got better. I'm not sure that's quite true, but I think it just speaks to the fact that this is a really, really tricky problem for the 21st century, and we're some way away from solving it.
Yeah, I think it's the only issue that whenever a defender gets a new technology, the offender is also getting the same technology. There is
Well, yeah,
no in between. There is nothing.
yeah, we often, I mean, the internet really it has enormous opportunities for all of us, but it also has enormous opportunities for criminals and other
Yes.
forms of nation state actors, military and intelligence agencies to exploit it as well, and they all understand that very, very well.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And it was very insightful and very pleasant to have you here and talk about cybersecurity and how we can enhance it and how it affects human security in every topic, in every field. Uh, we talked about hospitals, financial systems, everything is connected to the internet nowadays. So I hope we can meet again and discuss those things in a deeper extent and maybe provide more information to our viewers. Thank you again, Professor, for being with us and giving us your insights on this topic.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, there's certainly a lot to talk about, so
Yes,
let's continue
there's
that
definitely
conversation.
is. Thank you very much again. And for all of you watching us at home, don't forget to leave your comments or ask any questions that you want down below. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.